There are few statements in the Analects. There are few statements in the Analects that specifically address the question of knowledge and wisdom. To say that you know when you do know, and say that you do not know when you do not know, that is the way to acquire knowledge. The man of wisdom cultivates himself for its advantage. Now in Chinese, the character ren is often rendered as man, but since in Chinese it's gender neutral. So when we use the word ren, actually means person or human being in general. In Chinese, you have to say 男人 as the male or 女人 as female. So ren is human, gender neutral. To know is not, to know it is not as good as to love it. And to love it is not as good as to take delight in it. Devote yourself earnestly to the duties due to man and respect spiritual beings, but keep them at a distance. This may be called wisdom. The man of wisdom delights in water, is active, enjoys happiness, as contrasted with the man of humanity who delights in mountain and is tranquil and enjoys longevity. There are those who act without knowledge, but I'm not one of them. To hear much and select what is good and follow it. To see much and remember it is the second type of knowledge. And Confucius would consider himself not a wise person who is able to create without any prior knowledge. He's one of us who have to learn to realize himself. Ask about knowledge, the response, it is to know man, to know human beings. The man of wisdom has no perplexities. Some are born with knowledge, some learn through study, some learn through hard work, and there are also those who learn very hard and still do not know. Statements like that refer to the question of knowledge on the one hand and of course wisdom on the other. To help us to orient our thoughts to the Confucian conception of wisdom, I think it's helpful to note that a British philosopher by the name of Gilbert Ryle, in a very old book published in the 40s, I guess, called The Concept of Mind, makes a distinction between two types of knowledge, or two types of knowing. I've already referred to that. One is to know that, and the other one is to know how. To know that is to know propositional knowledge. In fact, all the courses offered at this university teach us to know that. Whether you study physics, chemistry, biology, East Asian studies, foreign culture subjects, you acquire a certain kind of knowledge, not necessarily packaged, but certain kind of knowledge, so that eventually you will know some of the features of East Asian civilization, basic grammars of the English language, basic rules of the game of physics, chemistry, and so forth. Another type of knowledge, which is actually a form of knowing, which is actually much more extensive, more ordinary, more involved in our daily life, is not part of the mission of the university. That is to know how. For example, how to ride a bike, how to play the piano. This knowledge of knowing how is different from the kind of knowledge you just described, knowing that. To To know how implies our ability to do it. So implicit in the knowing how is the ability to do it. Therefore, knowledge and action are unified. To know how involves the process of not only internalizing certain kind of skills, but I think in the Confucian context, the process of inscribing the knowledge in our minds and in our bodies. It's kind of inscription, which hopefully will be there forever. In the opening line of the Analects, is it not a pleasure to learn and to practice it repeatedly what has been learned? Many scholars criticize that position, say, well, this is a clear indication of taking memorization as very important. You know, just read it and memorize it without creatively understanding it. Just do it. But I think what it implies there is something, a message that is much more profound, more significant than simply the outmoded notion of memorization. It refers to the knowledge of knowing how. And that knowledge of knowing how requires constant practice, sometimes conscientiously, sometimes inadvertently, but it will have to be a daily ritual. You can even broaden that to say learning to be human is relevant to this. The proficiency eventually we acquire in learning how to do something is such that it becomes so much an integral part of us. You can say it becomes second nature. For those who know how to drive, you first will have to understand all the mechanics. Before long, you know you're doing it. Often you're not even aware you're doing it. It's very natural for you to do it. Of course, when there's an accident, then you're suddenly aware that you did something wrong or someone else did something wrong. But that kind of learning is the discipline of both the body and the mind. And this type of knowledge as internalized skills is really quite, not only quite common, it constitutes a very important part of our ordinary human existence. Even some very simple things we learn, how to sit correctly, how to brush your teeth correctly, and things of that nature, they're all internalized skills. Everything has to be learned. This is the meaning of being cultured. And in fact, we cannot exist otherwise. But to know what we know is not a difficult task. But to be aware of what we do not know is very complicated. And in fact, to learn, not just the Confucians, the Taoists have instructed us, to learn often is a very complicated process. But to unlearn is even more complicated. An interesting example of this is that the great pianist Arthur Rubinstein, and he was able to perform very, very well at the age of 11 or 12. He gave his first recital in Beethoven's piano concerto, I guess. And he felt that he mastered piano, totally internalized. He could do it very, very well. But in his 30s, when he was accomplished pianist, internationally known, he was instructed by a very famous piano teacher, say, look, you've done all these things wrong. This is not right. This is not the proper way of doing it. And he realized that he never went through the basics. He never studied all these drills, this routine. So there are two options for him. Try just to be the genius who's never really practiced, learned, and continue to flourish. Or to go through the painful process of trying to learn how to play the piano from the most basic notes. He opted for the second route. He said, I have to admit, I never learned. I didn't know how to do it rightly. He followed his teacher and went through all the basic drills, 10 years. And of course, while he was giving major concerts at the time. And he totally internalized and he flourished until he was in his 80s and 90s. And often he would never repeat, never repeat the practice. He would remember the practice and play very, very well. In fact, we have another example, just a contrast. If we do not read the autobiography of Yehudi Menuhin, who was a great violinist, we didn't know. He was like Rubinstein. He became an accomplished violinist at the age of 11, also played a concert. And also he realized that his lower bow was not very good. He never really mastered that because he didn't know the right technique. And yet he became an accomplished one. Instead of going back to the basic drill and do it time and time again to unlearn what he wrongly learned, he decided to hide it. Just play the upper bow most of the time. And yet, of course, he couldn't hide it all the time. His colleagues, his students, and most other people recognized it. It was a very painful, difficult experience. The great genius in music playing and some of the basics he was not able to control. These two examples show the complexity of knowing how as a way of becoming proficient in a particular skill which defines who you are. Because a pianist is defined by his ability to play the piano, a violinist is defined by his ability to play the violin. Michael Polanyi, a Chicago scholar, one of the great scientists, but also a philosopher of science, mentioned in the learning, especially the internalization of certain kind of skill, there is a tacit dimension which is never spoken and which is always there. We have to be critically aware of. That tacit dimension, he even used the word indwelling. Like living in a place, you dwelled in a place. Indwelling is a certain kind of skill that becomes indwelled in your being. Therefore, it defines who you are. If you're a good chess player, you internalize all the rules of the game of chess playing. He uses the expression subsidiary awareness as opposed to focused attention. Once you know you've internalized certain kind of skill, you're not being self-conscious. You do not have the focused attention when you do it. It's only the subsidiary awareness of what you do it. For example, if you drive a car proficiently, you're not consciously thinking about how do you do this or do that. When you play the piano, when you give a performance, you're not aware that you're doing it. You're not aware of your fingering. Once you become aware of your fingering, you very likely will make all kinds of strange mistakes. So this subsidiary awareness supports your total being in doing the thing you think you've already mastered. And this process of internalizing the skill, not simply as a technique, but as something which begins to define who you are. In fact, we do it daily. If we learn a language, in order to express ourselves, we do that. We practice it daily. We refine our skill daily. Often we're not aware of it. And often, if we're not aware, it's fine. We'll be able to really, truly master it. Now, in the Confucian literature, this type of learning, which the academy, modern academy, is not particularly interested in, turns out to be most important for us to understand ourselves, for us to become a moral agent, for us to interact with other people. This is the reason why wisdom is understood as knowing a person, knowing someone else. Now, you cannot know a person if you do not know yourself. The implication is knowing a person is through the process of analogy, to reflect upon things near at hand as a point of departure. As many Confucians noted, an archer who fails to hit the mark ought to turn around introspectively to rectify the mistake from within. The archer cannot blame the target is not set right, or the implement is not good enough. the archer will have to reflect upon himself to rectify the mistake from within. This is the Confucian concern that to know oneself internally is the precondition for doing things right in the external world. And this reminds me of a very interesting modern situation, a German scholar who decided to go to Japan to study archery. And after a whole year of study, he never released an arrow. The master only asked him how to get his posture right, how to stand right, how to release, but never shoot an arrow. And it's disciplining of the body for a whole year before he was allowed to do it. And hitting a mark is predicated on your ability to totally discipline yourself. Because no matter how much you stand still, your heartbeat will change the position. So how you will be able to control that situation is extremely painful and difficult. It's like learning ballet and any kind of very demanding artistic forms. And this analogy of using oneself as the point of departure becomes the basis for the Confucian conception of knowledge, true knowledge. True knowledge, then, is to try to understand other human beings, to understand how people do things together. I'll just use this very simple example. How do we know another person? We try to know another person. This is common human experience. The first time you encounter the person, what you know is simply the face, a person. You can recognize someone. This is what we call simply pattern recognition. As many of you know, in artificial intelligence, pattern recognition is a skill that the computer and all these fanciful gadgets learned very recently, only in the last 4 or 5 years. Before then, pattern recognition is extremely difficult. It's very easy for us to recognize a face because the human mind is able to ignore all kinds of details. The computer cannot in the early days without this pattern recognition. So the computer, in order to define a thing in a minute detail, would take a very, very large system to recognize a face, to recognize a pattern. Only recently, with fuzzy logic and so forth, you can ignore a lot of non-essential features. You'll be able to recognize the face right away. But it is human intuition, human technique can recognize the face. To say you can recognize someone's face is to say you can only single out a person from a group. You can identify the person. It doesn't mean that you know anything about the person at all. You may know some of the most superficial features. And then you want to understand the person, you acquire some kind of background knowledge, background information. Is it possible for you to say you really know the person if there's no interview at all? I want to study the person. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to interview him or her. And my knowledge, personal knowledge, is always deficient. Let's say we have a chance of interviewing. Unless, this is the theologian Portilic's major contribution, unless there is dialogue, there's no way that we can truly understand someone. Dialogue in this sense that through an encounter, not just an interview, an encounter, our awareness of the person becomes sharpened. Our own horizon of understand ourselves and some other person is being extended. New perspectives were introduced. We're not just superimpose our own bias, our own idea about what the person ought to be, but we allow the person to shape our understanding. In other words, the willingness of the person being understood becomes a precondition of our ability to understand someone. Now, there's a great deal of moral reasoning embedded in that process. In fact, how do we internalize an otherness as a way of understanding ourselves? And how do we mobilize the resources that we have in order to understand someone who's radically different. And that process ought to be a dialogical process, an interplay. Imagine this is radically different from understanding an object or studying a particular plant or physical phenomena or chemical process or how the world works according to abstract principles. Because our own life situation is at stake. There's an existential commitment involved. Michael Polanyi used the term fiduciary commitment, a commitment in terms of trust. This is how we make friends. Otherwise, it's almost impossible for us to make friends. We have all kinds of acquaintances, colleagues, fellow students, but how do we make a friend? And to make friends, meaning the dialogical mode becomes absolutely essential. A new kind of fellowship emerges out of this picture. Now, Confucius made an observation. On the surface, it's an observation about how one can become a leader. But if you digest it a little bit, it is really a manifestation. You can become a leader, only leader of people, not just leader of a company, a leader of people, a political leader in that sense. You cannot become a leader unless you have some embodied knowing, some form of embodied knowing, meaning internalized skill of understanding other human beings by analogy. When one's knowledge, this is direct quote, it's a long one, but I think it's very, very useful. It's 1532. When a man's knowledge is sufficient for him to attain his position, position of leadership, let's say, but his humanity is not sufficient for him to hold it. Even if he gets it, he will lose it again. When his knowledge is sufficient for him to attain it, and his humanity is sufficient for him to hold it, if he does not approach the people with dignity, the people will not respect him. If his knowledge is sufficient for him to attain it, his humanity is sufficient for him to hold it, and he approaches the people with dignity, yet does not act or do it in accordance with propriety, the most fitting way of doing it, it is still not very good. In a sense, the leader who becomes the leader of a fellowship, of a group, is not simply who has acquired the necessary knowledge about how to do it. The knowledge has to be sustained by an inner feeling of commiseration, inner feeling of humanity. But it's not only sustained by the inner feeling of humanity, you have to be able to exercise the golden rule of do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. Show that you respect the dignity of the people who are involved in that fellowship. And then the people will respond with a sense of respect. Even with all this, whether you will be able to do it according to the norm of being most appropriate, this still requires further refinement. So in this sense, leadership means knowledge embodied in one's humanity and responding to an appropriate situation according to the fitting norm. Now, if this is the purpose of Confucian learning, leadership as a standard of inspiration, then the Confucian education, we call the art of learning, is very much based upon one's ability to acquire an ever deepening or broadening self-awareness through the process of doing ordinary things. In elementary teaching, in the most basic elementary education in the Confucian tradition, the 6 arts are considered critical for anyone to learn, to master. One is rites, how to act according to propriety, or rituals. The second one is music. The third one is archery. And then horsemanship or charioteering, how to run the chariot. And calligraphy, the art of writing. And finally, mathematics, the art of calculation. These are the 6 elementary arts for primary school students. Rights, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, mathematics, or calculation, the art of calculation. Each one of them can be understood as discipline of the body and the mind. It's not just mental exercises at all. It's not the acquisition of certain kind of empirical knowledge, simply to know that. It is to do things, not alone, but in a company, in a group, and in order to refine one's understanding of not only one's own mind or the mental processes, but also one's own body. It is in this sense, when we get to the book by Herbert Fingeret, this will be discussed further, how to discipline ourselves so we can allow our bodies to become fitting expressions of ourselves. This is the Confucian art of learning. The art of learning is through all these rituals, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. We do with our hands, we do with our bodies. Then we will help ourselves to shape our body in such a way that it becomes a fitting expression of ourselves. The internalized skill, in this sense, we're not internalizing some external skills, like how to ride a bike, how to ride a horse, and how to do things. We internalize, in a sense, our bodily form. In sportsmanship, of course, this is easily understood. Body, in this sense, is not our private property. We do not own our bodies. In fact, we become our bodies. Now, recently, in the last 10 or 15 years, there's a school of thought in modern Western philosophy that puts a great deal of emphasis on this. The assumption that I own my body is an assumption which is outmoded, because it's the assumption what they call the body is like the ghost in a machine. The body is the machine, and the mind is like the ghost in a machine. So the mind controls the body. It's a duality. But that duality, often in our ordinary experience, it doesn't work. How can we control our body just through the mechanism of the mind? Now, in the classical Confucian formulation, on the surface, quite naive. That is, the body is a gift. It's not something that I'm entitled to. It's a gift. The gift has 2 senses. Assuming, this is very interesting, assuming from this is 17th century, some of the Confucian thinkers were trying to figure this out. Assuming that human beings came into being through evolution, from inanimate beings, animate beings, and so through evolution, then nature, which means heaven and earth, can be considered as our parents, because they offered us our body through a very long evolutionary process. Then we eventually become what we are. So this body comes into being through a very long and complicated process. So we should be grateful for heaven and earth, because they are like our parents who offer this to us. On the other hand, if our body comes into being because of our parents, then our parents are like heaven and earth to us, because they offer something which is not necessarily privately owned by us. So in this sense, I do not own my body as a piece of property. And in fact, the learning experience, especially of the very young, shows it takes a very long and sometimes difficult process of practice, repeated practice, for the person to learn how to walk, how to even stand up, and how to sit. And these simple acts, now of course, after we've mastered them, they become so much an integral part of us. We only exercise our subsidiary awareness. We're no longer being critically focused attention. But if you have your younger brothers or sisters is still learning how to walk and how to talk, you know the process is extremely difficult. And the time invested is incredibly long. And often one is not even aware of it. So this type of learning seems to show that the body is in fact an attainment. So all of us ought to be congratulated for the fact that we internalized through subsidiary awareness all these incredible skills, especially using our fingers and all kinds of things we learn through this process, become what we are. So it is an attainment. As an attainment, we should celebrate. But at the same time, as a continuous process of refinement, we have to be critically aware of the deficiency. There's more to be learned. There's more refinement required for that process. Now, normally, especially in the academic setting, we considered to be creative is to be inspired by certain kind of inspiration from the outside, therefore to depart from the ordinary routine. If we cannot do that, we're not being original, not being creative. Creativity and originality seems to point to something which is radically different, which is new. But if we follow this particular Confucian idea about knowledge and wisdom, creativity actually comes out of sustained effort. We have to think of creativity in terms of language, literature in particular, in terms of art, in terms of music, and of course in terms of sports. In this sense, it is inconceivable that anyone can be creative, let's say in literature, and manage to get a major prize in literature without being able to master, first of all, the basic grammar of that language. You cannot say, I'm so creative I can write in a totally ungrammatic way. So creativity is to identify those areas that we all ought to know, and yet we do not. So the great piece of art in literature in this sense is not to write something which is ungrammatical, which cannot be understood by ordinary people seasoned in the English language, but to shock us with new insight and ideas using the same kind of conceptual apparatuses each one of us is supposed to have. We all have these apparatuses, and yet someone is able to do it in such a way that it becomes a new discovery, a new realization. Music, it's not possible. Of course, there are music geniuses, like Mozart. But still, the process of learning, the process of refinement, the process of recombination, the process of transformation, indicate the total indwelling of the musical apparatuses. So the person becomes a musical being because constantly involved in that process. For a professional now, we may spend 6 hours trying to learn it. But for some of the people, 24 hours is the learning process. Every minute, one lives in one's literature, one lives one is music, one lives one is art. This kind of pleasure, practice it and do it time and time again, and then you become so proficient in that you will be able to use it in a way that no other human beings are capable of using it. That pleasure is what the Confucians would consider true creativity. Now, Confucius himself is not just being humble, but made it very clear that there are people who are born with knowledge, there are people who learn through study, there are people who learn through very hard work, And there are also people who work hard and still do not know. The first and the fourth category, those who are born with knowledge, like the sage kings, and those who work hard and still do not know, the so-called the people who cannot be educated. These two groups constitute maybe 0.001% of the human population. Too tiny for us to worry about. Don't worry about those who is able to create even without knowledge. Moses may be able to do that, and some great founder of great religious traditions. Sakyamuni probably was able to do it, but it's very tiny percentage of the human population throughout history. And there are people, no matter how hard they try, they cannot learn. Deficient in a very fundamental way. Again, we're talking about a tiny, tiny percentage. So most of us, Confucius said, myself included, learn through study. Learn through hard work. It is in this sense that reminds me of a very interesting discussion of T.S. Eliot, the great English literary writer, about tradition and individual talent. And in his conception, which is very Confucian, is that the true talent is someone who is a great transmitter of the tradition. Transmitter of the tradition is much more difficult from this point of view than simply a creator of a new tradition. Because the transmitter is obligated to understand the rules of the game of that tradition. It has to be a learner. A transmitter of a major English tradition, tradition of English literature, will have to go through a very long process of discipline, process of learning. And once the grammar of action, the grammar is totally internalized, then one is at a stage that one can be creative. So every talent, every new talent in the tradition totally reshapes that tradition. This is the creativity. Don't imagine the tradition as a cumulative process in which the last talent simply is an addition to a glorious past. I think music, again, is very useful in this connection. One sinologist, a scholar of Chinese literature, Joseph Levinson, made one observation. First, I didn't quite understand it, but the more I reflect upon it, the more I become convinced he's right. He said, after Beethoven, Mozart can never be heard the way that his contemporaries heard him. First, I said, what is this? Now, after Beethoven, meaning that we've been exposed to Beethoven, right? After we've been exposed to Beethoven, we couldn't get back to the Mozart as if Beethoven never existed. Tradition, in a way, as organic process, is not something which is cumulative in the sense that's mechanistically sedimented. So the last great hero is simply an addition to the glorious tradition. Tradition is always shaped by talents, continuously reinterpreted, refined, reshaped, rearticulated. So each talent, we should all include ourselves as potential talents in this case, are both the beneficiary of a tradition that shapes us into the form that we assume now, but at the same time, what we make out of what we are turn out to be, quote, creative in the transformation of that tradition. There's always an interplay, two-way traffic, rather than one. And this, of course, requires that we totally internalize the creative rules and regulations of that tradition, rather than passively being internalized, passively accepting the rules of the game. It is in this sense to know it, let's say humanity. We're part of a humanistic tradition, no matter where, in the West, in the East, we are part of this tradition. To know it is not as significant as to love it. In a sense, to know it, almost like to know that, that's my tradition, that which is out there. To love it is attitudinal, the inner feeling. There's some feeling of how I'm linked to it. Some of our colleagues, of course, consider themselves part of the great American tradition of philosophical inquiry. So they take Emerson very seriously. Now, if you simply try to know Emerson, he was that unusual Harvard professor who gave lectures on the Scala that shocked the divinity school somehow, and who was the great founder of the Unitarian tradition, who criticized the idea of Trinity. So we know a lot about. But to love it is to say there's certain kind of personal identification with the issues and problems he's engaged in. So not only simply want to understand him as a historical figure, we want to understand the historical significance of that person, Emerson, in terms of his presence here and now. When we walk through that gate, when we saw there is a quote from Emerson, we feel a kind of a spiritual resonance with that person. But then Confucius said, no, love it is not as truly meaningful as take delight in it. Because to love it is still this gap between that which is being studied, being analyzed, and myself. Whereas to take delight in it is a sense of total immersion. Now, if we take delight in it, then I can assume the responsibility of being a transmitter. And that responsibility is acquired, it's an achievement. You can even say that with your own body. As a gift, you now are responsible for it as a fitting expression for yourself, and your total immersion in it is a way of not only know it, love it, but also take delight in it. Learning then is awakening. There's a Chinese word, 学. I made a reference. But Confucius defined himself as fond of learning. And he only allowed one of his best students to say, well, Yang Hui was also fond of learning. Most of the others probably knew it's important, even love it, but in some way they were not fond of learning in the sense of take total delight in it. And because learning in this sense is awakening. Awakening meaning constantly alert. Alert in the sense that all the processes, especially knowing how, all the things that we learn that will enrich our life becomes meaningful. We take it seriously. Now, Confucius said that the wise delights in mountain, is active, and enjoys happiness, as contrasted with the humane, or the man of humanity, who loves mountain, who is tranquil, and who enjoys longevity. Implicit in this, the wise meaning people who are very intelligent, quick-minded. The wise are actually always in motion and reminds us of the flowing stream rather than a static, a stable mountain. And there is a joy when one is wise. But the Confucian idea of the wise has to be informed by humanity. Humanity functions at a higher level of human self-realization. So the person who loves water flowing, quick-minded in that sense, loves action, will also learn through self-transformation to appreciate mountain, the stability of mountain, the sense of tranquility, and even the idea of longevity. So how can the wise be guided by the spirit of humanity? Is something the Analects has a lot of interesting things to say about. So there's a bias, a very powerful bias in the Analects, not to consider people who are eloquent, they're quick-minded, able to express themselves well, as really a great fortune. And in fact, there's always warning that if you are quick-minded, if you're wise, you're intelligent, if you're not guided by the principle of humanity, you're going to be wasteful. This is, of course, I would call it a civilizational bias. Chinese civilization seems to have placed a great deal of emphasis on humanity in this sense. This civilizational bias in a comparative perspective is very, very intriguing and very helpful. I will end with this note. We know that the Greek philosophers particularly privilege the art of seeing. They privilege the eye. That's why in the modern English language, vision, insight, perception, keen observation, all these are very positive words. Of course, the Greeks were also interested in audio one, dance and music, so forth. But the Judaic tradition, in comparative sense, the Judaic tradition placed more emphasis on the audio. God never reveals himself in a sight, always through a voice. Even with Moses as the burning bush is to direct Moses to the sound, to the voice of God. So audio is very important. Now, with this Greek emphasis on the art of seeing, the Judaic emphasis on the art of hearing, it's easy to say the Confucians take both hearing and seeing seriously. But I think the Confucians seems to privilege the art of hearing. That's why the importance of the tuned ear. Why? I'm not sure. This is something you need to ask yourself. The art of seeing is spatial. It's directional. You can use your eyes to express your emotions, your feelings. And you could get a holistic structure very quickly. You forget it very easily as well. The art of hearing is more passive, more internal, more around. Try to express your feelings through your ears rather than your eyes. It's almost impossible. But your eyes can be very revealing. And in fact, when we see, we cast our eyesight to grasp something. So the eyes can be extremely aggressive. Ears, no matter how, can never be aggressive. Just to show your aggressiveness through your ears. So in this sense, to be able to listen requires patience, requires receptivity, and requires eventually some sense of inner peace. And that, I think, the sign of wisdom, not just in the Confucian tradition, in the Buddhist tradition in particular, is often revealed through the earlobe, a long ear. The sign of wisdom is not your ability to express your ideas very well, but your ability to listen very well. We have 3 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. I hope we can get 1 or 2 short questions. Anyone, anywhere, have a question now? Oh yes, please.
It also seemed that the common people were sort of considered to be much lower than the intellect, and I was wondering what you think it was important to Confucius, whether people tried within their means, because it seemed like almost to try to be a sage involved so many difficult, complex, almost unattainable things like being involved in politics, having relationships with other people, those things that someone who had to work all the time probably wouldn't be able to do or accomplish. Like, was it more important that they were trying, even though they weren't able to accomplish those things?
A very, very important question about the sense of hierarchy in the Confucian tradition. That some people, like the laborers, they have to spend 20 hours or 15 hours working. How can they cultivate themselves? How can they realize themselves? Whereas people with leisure may be able to do that. Therefore, to cultivate yourself with fine arts, poetry, and so forth. But this is only part of the story. What the Confucians try to do in this connection is that the process of learning to be human, especially learning for the sake of the self, is intended to be a universal process. Every person, no matter where you are, at what station, you're obligated to do that. That's the reason why I want to call your attention again to this major Confucian disciple who came from a very low background, maybe the poverty-stricken background of the society. He had no aspirations to become a leader, even though he had all these talents to become one. And he died young. Many of us had 70 years to cultivate ourselves. He only had about 30 or even lower. And yet, Confucius just totally overwhelmed by his ability to learn and to grow. So in that sense, every human being can go through the same process. This is the intention. Very different from the Greek idea that the contemplative mode of life is only reserved for very small, tiny, gifted philosophers. Most of us are like people in the cave. They'll never be able to do that. There's nothing like that kind of elitism in the Confucian mode of thinking. Politics, in this sense, is also the work of every human being. It's not just serving as a leader. Even if you manage your life in the privacy of your home, what you do is politically significant.